It is an ancient convention among interstellar cultures that wars, like the slow turning of a planet, eventually yield to periods of uneasy peace. Such had been the experience of the Galactic Union ever since its inception millennia ago. A coalition of races, varied in form, intelligence, and temperament, had found a fragile equilibrium by upholding certain codes. These codes revolved around fundamental respect for sovereignty, mutual defense accords, and the regulation of advanced weapons. Yet even in this vast union, with all its intricate treaties and centuries-long traditions, rumors had begun to circulate about a quiet, unassuming race that called itself humanity. These humans had emerged from a region of space that was largely unremarkable at first glance. A swirl of dust-laden star clusters many parsecs beyond the central worlds of the Union. They had settled a system they called Sol, containing a single yellow star and a handful of planetary bodies, the third of which they called Earth, their cradle of life. For some time, their representatives appeared in the Union's council chambers, always courteous and open to cooperation. They had a gift for forging alliances and bridging cultural divides. Within a few short centuries, the Terran diplomats' skill at negotiation made them fixtures at every major interstellar gathering. To many, they were indispensable arbitrators, always promoting compromise instead of conflict. The peaceful reputation of humans was so pervasive that certain factions in the Union questioned whether the Terrans possessed any significant might at all. Certainly, they had starships and technology. No species that roamed the stars did so without advanced propulsion or some measure of protective force. But the Terran arsenal was never flaunted. Humans spoke only of treaties, of unity, and of forging new paths together. If they had warships, they seldom displayed them. No Terran ever threatened another species with annihilation. Indeed, the humans seemed almost childlike in their optimism, refusing to exploit the weaknesses of others for personal gain. Over the decades, many concluded that these soft-spoken beings lacked the will and power to wage large-scale war. It was an assumption some found comforting, others found disquieting. Within the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the Galactic Union, a few wise or suspicious minds harbored more nuanced doubts. Could a race that had so swiftly negotiated its place among the stars truly lack any hidden teeth? Whispers abounded that humans had endured countless internal conflicts in their early history, honing cunning and ferocity that they now chose to bury. Yet rumors remained only that no proof existed to dispel the widely accepted notion of Terran passivity. Until the Devourers came. Admiral Zorak of the Drakth Empire remembered the first time he heard the name Devourers. It was whispered in the corridors of the Imperial War Academy like some half-imagined myth. The Academy's archivist insisted it was an ancient threat, rumored to be an entity beyond the known edges of the galaxy. The Drakth, known for their aggressive expansion and prideful stance in galactic politics, had historically scoffed at anything that could not be directly challenged with arms. So the young Zorak, then a fresh cadet, took little heed of these legends. But as the cycles rolled by, and he rose through the ranks from captain to admiral, the rumors of world-devouring horrors transformed into sightings. Frontier outposts went silent. Trade ships, once punctual to the hour, simply vanished. Then came the battered survivors, shell-shocked refugees from entire planetary systems who recounted how unstoppable swarms of unknown craft stripped stars of energy and left entire sectors bleak and lifeless. Zorak had been among the first senior officers to receive official confirmation from the Drakth High Council that the Devourers were real. Secure transmissions carried stories of how these creatures, if indeed they could be called that, did not engage in conventional warfare. They did not negotiate. They did not broadcast demands. They appeared in a system, overshadowing its sun with an armada that reconfigured solar energy into something monstrous. Within days, entire fleets were reduced to cosmic ash. Planets were stripped of life, and the star at the heart of the system was left to gutter and die, fueling the Devourers' inexorable spread. The Drakth Empire, proud and mighty, immediately convened its war council. Admirals and generals across the Empire's domain prepared for an all-out campaign. Reports trickled in. Drakth recon squadrons had encountered Devourer vanguards at the fringe of Drakth territory. Those advanced ships never returned. Skirmishes, each more horrifying than the last, attested to the Devourer's unstoppable nature. Their ships were silent, operating with uncanny coordination. Advanced plasma cannons, nuclear warheads, even the dreaded antimatter lances wielded by the Drachtha's largest dreadnoughts had little effect. For every Devourer vessel destroyed, dozens more replaced it. Out of desperation, the Dracht Empire petitioned the Galactic Union for assistance. It was a remarkable gesture. Historically, the Dracht seldom bowed to any other power, preferring to keep their conquests and technology to themselves. But the threat of the Devourers eclipsed pride. In urgent broadcasts, Emperor Sereth demanded immediate collective defense. The Union, for its part, watched with grave concern. The call for mutual protection was triggered, albeit slowly. Even in the face of ultimate destruction, bureaucratic channels had to be consulted, special committees convened, and unanimous votes tallied. Many species, including the reptilian Idyll, the amphibious Venori, and the ephemeral Crictions, dispatched contingents of their fleets. They pledged to stand with the Dracht. The humans, predictably, offered diplomacy. More than once, Terran diplomats proposed attempts at communication with the Devourers, an effort widely deemed naive. As the weeks wore on, the Devourers advanced deeper into Dracht space. Diplomatic notes, of course, fell upon the vacuum of their unrelenting path. Admiral Zorak was a figure tall for a Dracht, his chitinous plates etched with scars from campaigns on the barbaric worlds along the Empire's eastern frontier. His stand at the command dais of the DINS Hegemony's Talon projected calm certainty, though inside he wrestled with a primal dread. Not in his decades of service had he felt so helpless. He surveyed the fleet outside his flagship's viewport. Hundreds of warships in tight formation, sleek Dracht cruisers bristling with plasma arrays, slow but powerful Criction carriers teeming with drone wings, swift Idyll corvettes known for their cunning flanking maneuvers, plus a scattered complement of Venori capital ships. It was the largest combined fleet the galaxy had seen in centuries. Yet they all orbited a star that seemed forlorn, as if it sensed the unstoppable darkness approaching. Reports came in from every corner of Dracht territory. The Devourers pressed forward like a cosmic plague, never slowing, never hesitating. Worn-down defenders across multiple systems reported partial success at halting the Devourers, only to be overwhelmed by follow-up waves. Scientists analyzed bits of Devourer wreckage, what little could be obtained, finding that each destroyed section regenerated in a horrifyingly short period, as if it drew from some bottomless source of cosmic energy. An urgent update blinked on Zorak's console. He allowed himself a single anxious flick of his mandibular mouthparts before opening the channel. A Dracht officer's face appeared, battered and exhausted. "Admiral, the Devourers have entered the Cyrex sector. They will be at Kargith within days." Zorak stiffened. Kargith was a major Dracht stronghold, the last line of defense before the core systems. If Kargith fell, the Devourers would have a direct path to the Empire's homeworld and beyond. Without hesitation, Zorak broadcast a summons to the Allied ships. "All vessels, prepare for immediate jump. The time for a decisive confrontation is upon us. The Devourers approach Kargith, and there we must hold or perish." Kargith's star burned a vibrant purple-white, ringed by swirling cosmic dust. Over millennia, the Dracht had transformed the system into a fortress of imposing orbital stations, detection arrays, and heavily armed platforms. If any site could repel the Devourers, it would be here. From the bridge of the Hegemony's Talon, Admiral Zorak coordinated the final checks. All sensor grids and perimeter defenses reported ready, and Allied ships took up designated positions. The plan was to meet the Devourers with overwhelming firepower at the system's perimeter, forcing them to expend resources early. Then deeper layers of defensive lines would wear them down, while the reserve capital ships pounced on any breach. In theory, it was flawless. But theories often crumbled under cosmic realities. The battle began with a flicker, a sensor anomaly at the edge of the system's gravitational boundary. Then an ocean of black, chitinous shapes materialized. Each Devourer vessel's hull looked grown rather than built, shimmering with a quasi-organic texture that seemed to devour light rather than reflect it. Their formation was neither neat nor disordered. It was as if they were connected by an unseen will, weaving around each other fluidly. All ships opened fire. The command thundered through the comms. A moment later, space lit with the fury of countless energy bolts, plasma arcs, and nuclear projectiles. The darkness of the Devourer line glowed with the combined wrath of half a dozen allied species, brilliant enough to cast fleeting day upon Kargatha's night side. For seconds, hope swelled that raw force might succeed. The leading Devourer ships glowed and ruptured. Yet no sooner did the wave falter than the living mass behind it poured forward, overshadowing the light with sheer numbers. The watchers aboard the Drac stations gasped as the destroyed segments of Devourer craft seemed to regenerate, merging with larger hulls. They adapted, with thousands of smaller pods launching from the capital forms, swarming the defenders' lines like locusts. Allied ships were quickly overwhelmed, their shields failing under the unrelenting tide. On the Hegemony's Talon, Admiral Zorak cursed softly, firing volley after volley. Each time a Devourer vessel cracked, another replaced it, hungry and tireless. The Allied lines wavered, capital ships drifting in and out of formation. Pockets of heroic resistance sprouted. A Venori dreadnought unleashed a wave of antimatter bombs that vaporized entire swaths of Devourer drones. But the hulls filled almost immediately with fresh horrors. Within the hour, the fortress system that had once been Draktha's pride was ablaze. Ships spun lifelessly, station fragments drifting, and the unstoppable black mass continued to push deeper. Communication relays spat out desperate pleas for assistance, for some miracle. Admiral Zorak's command console was alight with red warnings. Catastrophic losses across all fronts. At that moment, a frantic call from a Drakt frigate sputtered through. They've reached the star. Oh gods, they're feeding on it. The Devourers had begun the last stage of their assault, deploying colossal structures that latched onto Kargatha's sun, siphoning its energy to fortify their number further. The star's surface dimmed in patches, as if a malignant blackness spread across it. Zorak's heart pounded. He had faced defeat before, but never on such a scale. The Allied fleet was on the brink of total destruction, pinned between the Devourer swarm and the system's gravitational well. There was no question of retreat now. The jump corridor was cut off. The Admiral eyed the countdown to star collapse calculations that the Drax scientists provided. Hours, maybe less, before the Devourers hollowed it out. And then a flicker appeared on the sensor grid, a new warp signature entering the system. One vessel, alone, brazenly dropping out of hyperspace in the midst of total calamity. The readout displayed an unlikely identifier, Terran warship Invictus. In the annals of the Galactic Union, the Terran warship Invictus had never been more than a rumor. Some said it was a myth conjured by human generals to dissuade potential aggressors. Others speculated that it was but a single battleship, hardly a match for an entire Devourer horde. Those who had glimpsed it described a haunting silhouette, neither flamboyant nor imposing, but imbued with an unspoken menace. Its hull was rumored to be layered in a strange alloy that defied classification in the Union's databases. Now, for the first time in living memory, the Invictus materialized on a battlefield for all to see. Admiral Zorak's weary eyes caught sight of it on the forward display, an elongated wedge shape, matte black, and seemingly unaffected by the electromagnetic turbulence that ravaged the region. Its arrival was punctuated by minimal fanfare, just a whisper across Allied comms. This is Captain Elias Carter of the Terran warship Invictus. We stand ready to assist. Zorak blinked, uncertain if he was hallucinating. Nonetheless, he responded, Terran vessel, you've arrived too late. The system is lost. Escape if you can. Captain Carter's voice was calm, almost paternal. Acknowledged, Admiral. But humanity will not abandon our allies. In short order, a single plasma beam from the Invictus arced across the void, slicing through several Devourer craft. They flared brightly as their unnatural hulls were vaporized. Zorak felt a momentary flicker of hope, but the Admiral knew how resilient the Devourers were. Those ships would simply reconstitute themselves unless hammered with unrelenting force. And hammered they were. For the next 20 minutes, the Invictus executed maneuvers that defied standard logic. It danced through the black swarm, unleashing a symmetrical barrage of beams and pulses. Some advanced technology, perhaps a gravitational spool or inertial dampener, allowed the Terran ship to change vectors abruptly without suffering the inertia that crippled other warships. Every time the Devourers closed in, swarms of Terran drones, sleek constructs carrying concentrated explosive warheads, counterattacked with surgical precision. The Allied fleet regrouped behind the Invictus. Their battered vessels took up positions that offered supportive fire whenever the Terran craft made a pass. For the first time in days, the Devourer's unstoppable advance seemed to falter. Yet it was still a drop in an ocean. The black wave, though momentarily slowed, was too vast. Already, they were forging new shapes, new tendrils of horror spreading over the star's surface, continuing the drain. On the Drac flagship's bridge, a glimmer of optimism shone in the Admiral's compound eyes, but he also recognized the cruelty of fate. Even with the valiant efforts of the Terran vessel, the star would soon be critically destabilized. Any moment, its compromised fusion core could collapse or supernova in a final cataclysm. Then Captain Carter's voice chimed in once more. "Admiral, you must order all Allied ships to retreat to at least 6 planetary units away from the star." Zorak frowned. "That's impossible, Captain. Our jump corridors are blocked, and the Devourers hold the perimeter. The star could blow at any moment. We won't survive if we remain here." "Yes," Carter replied. "But if you get behind the Invictus, we may open a path." "We tried breaking their lines. They reformed." "They always reform." Captain Carter was silent for a moment. Then he said, with a tone that chilled Zorak, "We have a weapon that will clear a lane. Follow us, quickly." Word spread instantly through Allied comm channels. The Terrans had come bearing a superweapon of unknown classification. Across the entire galaxy, humans were known for their reticence to use lethal force in diplomatic entanglements. What manner of weapon would they produce now, when their allies faced obliteration? Zorak issued immediate instructions for his battered fleet to cluster behind the Invictus. Already, pockets of the swarm attempted to envelop them from all directions. But in an astonishing display, the Terran warship's stealth systems flickered, and the hull seemed to blur. The Invictus plowed a corridor through the blackness, twisting and weaving, all the while laying down a storm of red-lit interceptors that exploded with unusual brilliance. The corridor was narrow, no more than a few kilometers across, but wide enough for the Allied ships to squeeze through. Under normal circumstances, the Devourers would have adapted quickly, swarming around the corridor, converging from every angle. But the Terran interceptors unleashed a new type of energy, something that distorted local space, warping the Devourer ships in unpredictable ways. Their organic-like shells cracked, forcing them to divert significant resources to regeneration. A staccato of frantic transmissions flew among the Allied ranks, stunned awe at witnessing a single ship hold back this unstoppable horde. At last, they reached a safe distance from Kargatha's star, though safe was relative. They still had to find a means to jump away. Meanwhile, the Devourers began regrouping, black tendrils arcing out to surround the Terran vessel. On the Hegemony's Talon, Zorak watched with grim fascination as Captain Carter issued a final order. "All Allied ships, shift to maximum distance. We're going to detonate the Nova Bomb." Nova Bomb. The name alone conjured dread. In the annals of known weaponry, the term Nova had been thrown about in theoretical circles, the idea of triggering a star's collapse or harnessing a star-like reaction on a smaller scale. But no group in the galaxy had ever claimed to have such a device in active deployment. Even the Drakth, with their militaristic tradition, found the concept too catastrophic to be feasible. Captain Carter's unwavering voice cut across all channels. "Repeat, all ships are to stand clear. The Nova Bomb will eliminate the Devourers in one strike. We can't guarantee safety within a close radius. Brace for potential starquake." Some Allied captains voiced alarm. The bomb might reduce the entire system to cosmic rubble, but they had no real alternative. The Devourers still clung to the star, draining it, and if they were not stopped now, the entire galaxy would inevitably fall. Admiral Zorak, steeling himself, opened a direct link. "Captain Carter, can your vessel withstand the detonation?" "Most likely," came the measured reply. "Stay back, Admiral. May fortune favor us all." For a fleeting moment, the battlefield fell eerily calm, as if the Devourers sensed an imminent shift. The Invictus held position near the star, overshadowed by the black mass of tendrils. The swirling cosmic dust of Kargatha's system glimmered in the star's last rays. Suddenly, a glowing sphere the size of a small moon emerged from the Terran warship's underbelly. It radiated an intense white luminescence shot through with arcs of swirling energy. Across the Allied channels, gasps and frantic curses mingled in equal measure as the Nova bomb's presence was confirmed. In a single, cataclysmic instant, the device was released into the star's orbit. An unstoppable gravitational well locked the warhead onto a collision course with Kargatha's sun. The Devourers sensed the threat too late. A fraction of their swarm attempted to intercept, but the Invictus hammered them with a barrage of blinding energy pulses, forcing them back. Admiral Zorak gripped the railing, his eyes fixated on the bomb's final approach. Then the star ignited. For those within visual range, it was as though the cosmos itself tore open. The Nova bomb did not simply explode. It catalyzed a stellar eruption, forcing the star's compromised layers to fuse in a violent chain reaction. A shockwave of superheated plasma and exotic particles rippled outward. The cosmic flare from Kargatha's sun reached a brilliance that overwhelmed every sensor. The Allied ships, even at their distance, trembled as shielding struggled to absorb the wave. In that staggering blaze, the Devourers were trapped. Every last blackened hull, every tendril embedded in the star, was atomized in a single stroke. Those feeding vessels that had begun to reconstitute themselves were caught in the swirling meltdown. Like ephemeral shadows under a tidal wave of light, they disappeared. From the vantage of the Allied command ships, it was like witnessing the birth of a new star. The Kargath sun, forcibly stabilized by the bomb's chain reaction, flared with renewed vigor. When the glare subsided, the entire swarm was gone, a swirl of dust and cosmic remnants. The star itself burned with an unearthly brightness. And at the epicenter of that cosmic fury floated the Terran warship Invictus, its shields crackling but still intact. Admiral Zorak exhaled in relief and trembling awe. In the aftermath, the Allied ships regrouped, scanning the system for any traces of Devourer vessels. None remained. The once silent comms erupted in jubilant cries as the battered survivors from the Drakth, Idle, Venori, and other species began to realize they had been saved in the final hour. Admiral Zorak ordered immediate attempts at re-establishing warp corridors. His communications team reported that jump gates were resetting. Though the star had been shaken, it had survived, stabilized by the bomb's improbable engineering. Massive amounts of cosmic debris needed to be cleared, but for now, the Devourer threat had been vanquished. All attention turned to the Invictus. Admiral Zorak addressed them in a broad-frequency broadcast. On behalf of the Drakth Empire and every allied species, we offer you our deepest thanks. You have saved countless lives. Please, let us know how we can repay this debt. For some time, there was no reply. Then Captain Carter's calm voice returned, though tinged with a weary edge. We appreciate your gratitude, but there is no debt to be collected. Our only request is that you remember, humanity stands for peace, but we are not powerless. Before Zorak could respond, the Invictus pivoted, powered its engines, and shot into hyperspace with a flare of unknown color. Within seconds, the Terran warship was gone, leaving behind an uneasy silence. Word spread through the galaxy faster than any warp vessel could travel. The Terran single-handed defeat of the Devourers at Kargath became a legend overnight. Astounded ambassadors from the Union of Worlds demanded thorough explanations. How had the humans concealed such weaponry? What was this Nova bomb that could manipulate a star's core reaction? And why had they not used it before? An undercurrent of fear rippled through the corridors of power. Species that once regarded humans as innocuous ambassadors now questioned every prior assumption. If the Terrans possessed the means to neutralize the Devourers in one blow, what else might they be hiding? The Drakth, having witnessed the ordeal firsthand, found themselves in the unprecedented role of acknowledging that their might had been eclipsed by a race they had once considered lesser. Admiral Zorak's official report stoked the fires of speculation with every detail of the Terran warship's feats. Within the Galactic Union, a special council was convened. Representatives from dozens of species gathered in a grand circular chamber on the capital world of Nova Corinthia. The humans, naturally, were invited to share an account of the events at Kargath. Dressed in their subdued formal attire, the Terran delegation stepped forward, led by Ambassador Josephine Marlowe and a cadre of military advisors. They offered carefully worded explanations, admitting the existence of advanced weaponry but downplaying the impetus behind it. We have discovered that to safeguard peace, sometimes an ultimate deterrent is necessary, Ambassador Marlowe said politely. We regret the necessity of such destruction. The Nova bomb was a last resort. Many delegates pressed for more details. How many bombs did they possess? Were they mass-produced? Could the Terrans trigger stars into supernovas at will? The humans gave ambiguous answers. They insisted that their aim was always harmony, that they had no desire for conquest or subjugation, that the use of the bomb was forced by the existential threat of the Devourers. Still, distrust and awe seeped into the assembly, forging a new reality in galactic politics. No longer were the Terrans merely skillful diplomats. They were a species that had chosen the path of peace, but with fists that could shatter suns. In the Drakth Empire's capital, a planet of sweeping deserts and towering black spires, Emperor Sereth convened his war council. Admiral Zorak stood at attention, delivering his personal account of Kargatha's final battle. The humans used a single warship and a single bomb, Zorak concluded, and eradicated the Devourers. Our entire combined fleet had failed. The humans accomplished it alone. Emperor Sereth, dressed in regal battle plates, strode around the Grand War table, his reptilian eyes flicking between holographic projections of the Nova bomb's detonation. You are certain they hold no ill against us? Zorak took a measured breath. So it seems, Your Excellency. They had ample opportunity to demand tribute or concessions, but they did not. Their captain, Carter, merely asked that we remember their power and not mistake their gentleness for weakness. A hush settled over the council. The Drakth were not accustomed to feeling indebted to any species. Yet in this scenario, they owed their survival to the Terrans. Emperor Sereth finally nodded. Then we extend them a formal gesture of thanks. Let it be known that we are not foolish enough to provoke them. Weeks stretched into months. Across the galaxy, celebrations broke out. For the Devourers, an existential threat that had nearly consumed entire sectors, were gone. Smaller pockets of Devourer activity, far from Kargath, were quickly mopped up once word spread of how to coordinate with Terran forces. Indeed, the humans dispatched several more warships to assist in cleansing the galaxy of leftover Devourer cells. Each time, their advanced technology proved decisive. Yet peace brought as many questions as it did answers. Scholars of the Venori scribbled lengthy treatises on the ethical implications of star-altering weapons. The Crixian philosophers held silent vigils to lament the cosmic devastation, however necessary it had been. The Drakth, meanwhile, experienced a strange cultural shift, no longer boasting of their unrivaled dominance. Even the most bombastic among them had to concede that there was a greater power lurking behind the Terrans' polite smiles. Some suggested forging a deeper alliance with humanity, an official treaty that ensured continued cooperation. Others whispered that the galaxy had simply exchanged one unstoppable threat for another. Rumors persisted that the Terrans possessed entire fleets of Invictus-class ships, each bearing weapons that could extinguish entire star systems. Fear not at the minds of potential rivals. Amid this uncertainty, one certainty reigned supreme. Humanity had chosen restraint for centuries, refusing to brandish the power they evidently possessed. They had skillfully negotiated treaties to avoid conflict, not because they were afraid to fight, but because they were determined not to unleash their technology unless absolutely necessary. For Admiral Zorak, the aftermath of the Devourer War brought a personal dilemma. His entire life, he had been taught that the Drakth Empire was the pinnacle of martial prowess. He had built his career on that assumption, leading campaigns of conquest and holding Drakth supremacy as an article of faith. Now, that faith had been undone by the memory of a Terran warship overshadowing an entire devouring swarm. In the weeks after the conflict, Zorak found himself poring over star charts, historical archives, and any snippet of Terran data he could find. He read about Earth's ancient wars, the struggles that had shaped their civilization, and the eventual forging of their modern ethos. He studied transcripts of their philosophical texts, gleaning insight into why they were so determined to keep their capacity for destruction sheathed. At last, Zorak petitioned the Drakth High Council to allow him an official ambassadorial journey to Earth. It was an audacious request, given the Drakth rarely sought to build personal relationships with other species. Emperor Sereth, after some hesitation, granted him leave. Go, Admiral, Sereth said. Look upon this Earth. If we can learn to respect them, perhaps we can form a bond that strengthens the Empire. And so Admiral Zorak traveled across the galaxy, passing from Drakth territory into the quiet systems that formed the Terran frontier. He was accompanied by a small entourage of loyal Drakth officers equally curious about humanity's secrets. Zorak's first view of the Sol system was unremarkable on a cosmic scale. A bright yellow star, ringed by rocky planets, gas giants, and swirling asteroid belts. But on approach to the third planet, Earth, he began to comprehend the roots of Terran culture. Orbital stations ringed Earth's exosphere, though they were dwarfed by the planet's vibrant blue and green surface. This was a world of oceans, forests, deserts, and polar caps. Thousands of ships traversed the system, but few were heavily armed war vessels. Instead, the Drac observed cargo haulers, scientific research craft, space liners for civilian travel, all bustling with a sense of open commerce and curious exploration. It was as if the entire Terran civilization existed in a state of energetic, creative activity rather than militaristic vigilance. "We welcome Admiral Zorak of the Drac Empire," came the voice of Earth's orbital control. There was no hostility, only an eager courtesy. Zorak's shuttle was granted landing permission on a platform in the newly built Unity City, a shining metropolis that served as Earth's primary diplomatic hub. Stepping onto the platform, Zorak felt Earth's gravity, marginally lighter than Drakth's capital world. He was greeted by a small honor guard in Terran uniforms. At their head stood Ambassador Marlowe, flanked by a familiar presence, Captain Elias Carter. For a moment, the Admiral's hearts beat faster, remembering how Carter's warship had saved them at Kargath. Zorak bowed his chitinous head, a show of deep respect. "On behalf of the Drac Empire, I thank you once more. We live because of your intervention." Captain Carter inclined his head in return. "We did only what had to be done. And we request," Zorak continued, forcing aside the tension in his voice, "that we forge deeper understanding between our peoples. Let us ensure the horrors of Kargath never repeat." Marlowe smiled. "That is our wish as well, Admiral. Welcome to Earth." Over the following days, Zorak and his delegation toured the Terran capital, their universities, and their historical sites. They saw grand libraries filled with cultural achievements, museums preserving relics of Earth's past wars, and how those wars shaped modern humanity's refusal to unleash their destructive potential. They visited the Terran Orbital Memorial, commemorating all species who perished at the hands of the Devourers, featuring a newly unveiled monument, a stylized flame symbolizing the star at Kargath, with inscriptions in dozens of alien scripts. Yet, at every turn, the Drac visitors were perplexed by humanity's paradoxical nature. Their cities were vibrant, peaceful, focused on scientific progress, arts, and an almost obsessive commitment to forging interspecies friendships. Then they were shown a discreet facility tucked away behind security perimeters, where the Terran Defense Initiative developed starship armor so advanced it made the Drakth's best alloys look brittle. They glimpsed closed-off labs that rumor said housed the designs for more Nova bombs, or possibly weapons far beyond that capability. Captain Carter accompanied them occasionally, sharing tidbits of Terran philosophy. "Peace is never permanent," he explained. "We learned from centuries of conflict that we must keep our power in check. If we tip the balance with overwhelming force, we risk becoming the destroyers rather than defenders." Admiral Zorak could not help but recall how swiftly the Invictus destroyed the Devourers. If humans ever turned that might on the Drakth or any other species, the war would be over before it began. Zorak's official itinerary ended with a formal audience at the Terran Council. There, ambassadors from Earth's various regional blocks and space colonies gathered to solidify new treaties with the Drac Empire. They exchanged respectful phrases and promised to open channels of trade, cultural exchange, and military cooperation, particularly in intelligence sharing about future cosmic threats. Yet amid the toasts and ceremonial gestures, the Drac delegation sensed a subtle tension. They recognized that humanity, for all its approachability, possessed an edge sharper than any blade known in the galaxy. As the Terrans parted ways, amicable smiles on their faces, Zorak felt a chill, an awareness that beneath the congenial pleasantries lay the slumbering potential of unstoppable devastation. When time came for the Drac to depart Earth, Zorak asked Captain Carter for one final conversation. They met in a quiet garden overlooking an Earth sunset. Orange and pink clouds illuminated the sky, giving the alien planet a serene glow. "Captain," Zorak began, "I speak not just as a Drakth admiral, but as one who has witnessed your might. What do you see for the future?" Carter regarded the setting sun thoughtfully. "We see a galaxy free from the Devourers, where species can breathe and flourish. We see alliances that preserve life rather than destroy it." Zorak's voice lowered. "And what if new threats arise? Will the Terrans intervene as you did at Kargath?" "If it threatens the galaxy's existence, we will," Carter said quietly. "We do not seek to rule, Admiral, but we will protect. That is our vow." Zorak nodded slowly. "Your vow is admirable, yet it is a fearsome power you hold." Carter sighed. "It is indeed, and we carry the burden of using it only when there is no other choice." With that, they parted, the last rays of sunlight dancing upon Zorak's polished armor. In the ensuing years, the galaxy struggled to adapt to the new normal. No significant species openly challenged the Terrans, and no fresh horror like the Devourers emerged. Yet the knowledge of humanity's star-shattering capacity cast a profound shadow on interstellar diplomacy. Multiple species took steps to develop deterrence, though none could replicate the Nova bomb. A quiet arms race brewed in the background, with some powers seeking to close the gap. Human ambassadors continued to quell tensions by attending negotiations, forging treaties, and guaranteeing mutual defense. Over time, a new faction emerged in the Galactic Union, the Preservation Council. Headed by members of various species, including some Terrans, they advocated universal disarmament of doomsday weapons. The question, of course, was whether humanity would relinquish its trump cards. So far, no official statement said that they would. And so the galaxy existed in a precarious balance. On one side, grateful for the humans' role in eradicating the Devourers. On the other, quietly fearful of Earth's extraordinary capabilities. Now, some decades after the Battle of Kargath, Admiral Zorak found himself in a far-flung sector of Dract territory, investigating a strange disturbance that had been reported by frontier scouts. He was older, the scars on his shell deeper, and though he still donned the Imperial uniform, it was with less arrogance. His experiences had tempered him. Scans revealed a solitary derelict drifting in the blackness, faintly organic in design. A relic of the Devourers? This discovery stirred the Admiral's old fears. The Devourers had been all but exterminated at Kargath, yet rumors persisted that small pockets might still exist. Zorak approached the vessel cautiously, leading a small expedition aboard a Dract corvette. To his horror, the interior was partially alive, pulsating with a faint glow reminiscent of Devourer biomass. It appeared dormant, but the Dracth's technology indicated that it could be reactivated or reconstituted under the right conditions. Some new evolution that had survived the Nova bomb's devastation? Zorak recalled how unstoppable the Devourers had seemed. Even with the power of the Terrans, it had taken the ultimate weapon to defeat them. If this remnant awakened, the galaxy might once again be imperiled. As the Admiral tried to decide how best to proceed, he received a coded transmission. The Terran warship Invictus had arrived in orbit. Zorak was both relieved and uneasy. The presence of the Invictus signified that the Terrans were aware of a potential new threat. His corvette relayed an update. Captain Carter was on the comm, requesting permission to assist. "Admiral, we detected a Devourer's signature from scanning stations along the border," Carter explained. "We came as soon as we confirmed the source." Zorak, swallowing his pride, replied, "We appreciate your presence. We've discovered partial Devourer tissue. It is dormant for now." "Admiral," Carter said softly, "we must ensure it remains so. If it reactivates, it could spawn a new wave." Zorak nodded. "Agreed. Stand by." He had planned to destroy the derelict with high-yield warheads, though the Dracth's largest available bombs did not guarantee total annihilation of the husk. Captain Carter's assistance might be the surest way, but as Zorak gazed at the empty corridor of the Devourer craft, he was acutely aware of what calling on Terran assistance might entail. Another Nova bomb? Another demonstration of unstoppable force? Yet the risk was too great to do otherwise. Better to accept Terran help than risk a resurgence of universal devastation. With a heavy heart, Zorak sent the call to the Invictus. "Captain Carter, we request your immediate support." In a flash of bright light, Carter and a small Terran team teleported aboard the Dract corvette. They brought with them specialized containment modules, devices that manipulated gravitational fields and fired bursts of exotic radiation. Zorak and his officers observed, perplexed, as the Terrans deployed these modules along the spine of the derelict Devourer craft. Slowly, the black biomass that had begun to stir under scanning instrumentation retracted, as if forcibly suppressed by the module's field. "We've adapted some of the technology we used against the Devourers at Kargath," Carter explained. "But this time, we aim to contain rather than detonate." Zorak watched the slow subjugation of the Devourer tissue, a swirl of black receding into itself under the module's pulses. "You are capturing it." "Studying it," Carter corrected. "We intend to keep a sample under heavy quarantine, to learn more about its properties. Perhaps there's a way to neutralize or reverse its destructive capabilities without annihilating entire star systems." The Admiral's ridged brows arched. This was a new side to Terran might, an effort to preserve, study, and hopefully find a cure for the cosmic plague that had once threatened all life. It was a stark contrast to the raw destructiveness of the Nova bomb, yet it was undeniably the same hand at work. A race that could detonate a star could also muster the technology to cradle a single sample of devourer biomass in stasis. Zorak felt a mixture of relief and awe. Yes, truly unstoppable, but also controlled. With the devourer remnant safely contained, the Drath corvette and the Invictus parted ways. This time, as Captain Carter and Admiral Zorak shared final words, there was a warmth to the exchange. Zorak lowered his voice. "Captain, I feared you would simply obliterate this derelict to remove any chance of reactivation." Carter nodded. "It was a possibility. But we see potential in understanding the Devourer's biology. Eliminating them was necessary, but the knowledge might help us face future threats, or prevent them altogether." The Drath Admiral paused, recalling a time when his entire approach to warfare revolved around raw might. "One day," he said, "I hope to see a galaxy where we do not live in fear of unstoppable forces." "So do we," Carter replied. "And if that day comes, it will be through cooperation, not subjugation." They exchanged mutual salutes before Carter's image flickered off the communication screen. The Drath corvette turned away, heading back to the Empire's core worlds, while the Invictus soared off to a Terran research station with the dormant sample locked inside specialized containment units. As word spread of the Terrans' new approach, capturing Devourer remnants instead of instantly destroying them, debate flared within the Galactic Union. Some species applauded the advanced research, praising humanity's quest for a cure to cosmic threats. Others whispered that humans were meddling with forces best left destroyed. If these remnants break free, the Idle clan leaders argued, could they not spawn a new swarm worse than before? Within Terran society itself, opposing factions struggled. Some humans believed that any vestige of the Devourers should be erased, that to keep such a sample was madness. But the leading voices in the Terran government insisted on science and discovery. The Preservation Council welcomed the approach, seeing it as a testament to humanity's moral responsibility. Admiral Zorak watched these developments from afar, feeling a cautious admiration for the humans' boldness. Years passed. Peace endured, despite the undercurrent of fear that the galaxy felt whenever they saw a Terran warship. The Drath Empire rebuilt, forging alliances rather than conquests. The Idle, Venori, Crictians, and others joined in a renewed sense of cooperative vigilance, striving to ensure no threat like the Devourers would ever again arise unchallenged. And the humans? They continued to wander the stars as traders, diplomats, and, when needed, protectors. The name Invictus became synonymous with an unspoken promise that if the galaxy found itself on the precipice once more, the Terrans would be there. Many wrote stories about them, some painting them as benevolent guardians, others as potential tyrants who held the entire galaxy hostage through fear. Historians argued back and forth, yet no consensus formed. Perhaps it was both. For Admiral Zorak, approaching the twilight of his career, the final measure of humanity was not in the Nova bomb's terrifying flash, but in the calm resolution of Captain Carter's voice saying, "We have the power to choose restraint." In a quiet dawn on Drachtha's capital world, Admiral Zorak stood on a parapet overlooking the towering spires. He remembered the scorching deserts of his youth, the War Academy lessons that taught him to respect only strength. And he recalled that humbling day at Kargath, where the unstoppable swarm was eradicated by the Terran's single bomb. He had come full circle, from fear and awe to cautious respect. A new generation of Drath officers was emerging, less prideful, more open to the alliances that had saved them all. For centuries, the Drath had prided themselves on conquest. Now they prided themselves on vigilance and cooperation. In his final official address, broadcast throughout Drath space, Admiral Zorak spoke of humility. Power, in itself, is neither good nor evil. It is the intent and the choice that define its worth. We have witnessed a race so mighty that few could stand against them, yet they sheath their sword, drawing it only in defense of life. Let us learn to do the same. By the next sunrise, Zorak had resigned from active duty, stepping aside to ensure the Drath Empire's future path lay in steadier, younger hands. Across the galaxy, the memory of the Devourer's defeat lived on, a testament to the terrible and protective might of humanity. Some harbored nightmares that one day the Terrans might turn the Nova bomb or something worse upon them. Others found comfort in the knowledge that if any new cosmic horror arose, the Terrans would not hesitate to stand firm once again. And on Earth itself, as the sun rose over Unity City, children learned in their lessons about the day the Terrans had saved the galaxy from extinction. They learned about the price of such power, about the responsibility it carried, and about the unwavering choice to use it sparingly. Someday, they would grow up and pilot the next generation of Terran vessels, bearing the same burden, to keep the galaxy safe, not through conquest, but through measured restraint. Because for all their unmatched might, the humans had chosen peace, and in choosing peace, they shaped the galaxy's future. So ended the Great War against the Devourers, with an entire galaxy awakened to the reality that the unassuming Terrans were no timid diplomats, but guardians bearing the power to shatter stars. Yet their legacy proved not one of oppression, but of merciful vigilance. Though many species lived with a tremor of fear whenever they glimpsed a Terran warship, that fear was tempered by gratitude and respect. In the silent corridors of memory, the phrase echoed, "They avoid war because no one could stop them. And for the sake of countless lives yet to be born across the stars, may they continue to choose peace." The wreckage of war seldom leaves room for hope, yet it is often in those bleakest corners that the faintest embers of compassion begin to glow. This tale begins on the desolate planet of Zephara, whose once vibrant surface had been charred by the ceaseless combat of interstellar powers vying for strategic ground. Amid the crumbling towers and silent thoroughfares, once thrumming with prosperity, stood a lone figure, Captain Daniel Hayes, a seasoned officer in the Interplanetary Peacekeeping Coalition. Though advanced in years, silver hair at his temples and calloused hands betraying decades of soldiers' labor, Captain Hayes still carried in his heart the gentle flame of mercy. It was this very flame that guided him through the ruins, past fallen structures smoldering with the bitter memory of bombs, until he happened upon the small, alien child who would forever alter the trajectory of his life. Wrapped in tattered cloth, nearly invisible against the twisted metal and soot-stained rubble, the child seemed almost a phantom at first. Yet the moment Hayes saw her wide, frightened eyes, a striking shade of violet framed by skin so blue it appeared to glow in the faint morning light, he realized she was far more than a specter. She was alive, though barely, and her trembling limbs spoke of days, perhaps weeks, without nourishment. White flecks dotted her cheeks like distant stars in a twilight sky, and her delicate frame shivered at the slightest movement of the wind. Hayes approached slowly, mindful not to startle her. The war had taught him caution, but it had not quenched his empathy. Reaching into the ration pouch at his belt, he produced a small compressed nutrient bar, one of the few he had left after days in the field. Holding it out, he observed how the girl's gaze flickered with both mistrust and desperate need. She cautiously extended a trembling hand, then snatched the bar as if expecting him to snatch it back. Perhaps that had happened to her before. She devoured it with such hunger that Hayes felt a pang of sorrow well up within him, realizing she must have survived for who knew how long by scavenging from the wreckage. In that moment, he made a decision that would bind them together. He reached out, gently placing a hand upon her thin shoulder. Feeling the fragile bones beneath, he resolved that leaving her behind was unthinkable. He did not know who she was or what had led her to this forsaken place, but neither the War Council nor his commanding officers would deter him from showing her the kindness she so desperately needed. "Come," he said quietly, hardly sure if she understood. "You can't stay here." Her name, as he would later discover, was Lyra, or a word close to it in her own tongue, but for now, she could barely speak. He scooped her into his arms, felt how insubstantial her weight was, and began the careful trek back to his landing craft. Overhead, the sky of Zephara mirrored the sorrow below, roiling with ashen clouds that parted only occasionally to reveal the pale sun. He had arrived a short time earlier for reconnaissance, to see if the rumored infiltration by rival factions was credible. Yet what he found was an abandoned city and, in its rubble, a solitary child, starving for both food and comfort. Once aboard his small craft, an aging but reliable ship called the Morning Star. Hayes carefully wrapped her in a thermal blanket. He rummaged through his meager supplies and set about preparing a more substantial meal, some broth from dehydrated vegetables. Nothing extravagant, but warm and nourishing. As it simmered, he tended to her injuries. Her limbs were peppered with bruises, and her knees bore the deep cuts of one who had crawled over broken glass. He sterilized and bandaged them as gently as he could, speaking words of reassurance that she might not comprehend but hopefully felt. "Let's see if we can figure out a name for you," he murmured once she was fed and resting. She was so exhausted that she could barely keep her eyes open, yet she managed a fragile smile. Hesitantly, she uttered a sequence of syllables in her melodic language. To Hayes's ear, it sounded like Lyra, though the tone was soft, almost like a whisper in the wind. "Lyra," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. She blinked in recognition, and he nodded. "That's what we'll call you." He could tell she was uncertain, perhaps even frightened by this unfamiliar environment. The girl who would become Lyra did not speak again for some time, preferring to communicate through gestures and expressions. Hayes, for his part, did not press. He knew from experience, both as a soldier and as a man who had seen too many orphans left behind in the wake of conflict, that trust would need to be carefully nurtured. He did not know the details of her species or from what star system she hailed, yet it mattered little at that moment. All that mattered was that she needed help and had found, in him, someone willing to offer it. In the ensuing weeks, Captain Hayes and Lyra traveled together through the battered sectors of Zephara, performing rescue missions where they could. His orders were to map out the devastation and ascertain whether the planet was salvageable for civilian rehabilitation. Lyra, never straying far from his side, discovered a measure of security aboard the Morning Star. She learned to sit quietly on the co-pilot's seat, a blanket draped around her shoulders, watching intently as Hayes piloted the craft over broken domes and collapsed highways. Though she scarcely spoke, her violet eyes often glimmered with curiosity. Hayes sensed her fascination with the instruments on the control panel, and once, when he stepped away to check the engine in the back, he found her tentatively pressing one of the smaller buttons. A beep resounded, prompting her to jerk back in alarm, but Hayes only chuckled. Her curiosity reminded him of a grandchild he never had, a sense of innocence he thought the brutalities of war had stolen from him long ago. Sometimes, in moments of stillness, she would tap him gently on the arm, and in halting syllables, she would try to express herself in the common tongue. He listened patiently, responding with simple words and encouraging nods. Over time, a few phrases took shape. She learned to say food, sleep, and safe. She also repeated his name. The closest approximation her alien vocal cords could manage was Deyul, which she said with a faint smile. And so the two formed a modest language of their own, bridging the gulf of species and experience through quiet gestures and soft words. During these missions, Hayes would occasionally stumble upon more survivors, both human and alien, hiding in bunkers or half-destroyed basements. He offered them the same compassion he extended to Lyra, though supplies were limited. Rumors abounded that the warring factions had left Zephara intentionally ravaged, its resources stripped, its population terrorized into fleeing. Even if the coalition managed to secure peace treaties, the path to rebuilding the planet would be long and arduous. Lyra, perhaps too young to understand the larger political ramifications, clung to Hayes whenever new refugees arrived, as though she feared he might abandon her in favor of rescuing someone else. But Hayes's resolve never wavered. Each time, he would reassure her with a gentle hand on her shoulder, a small nod that said, "We are together in this." He did not fully know why this child, in particular, stirred a paternal protectiveness in him. Perhaps it was the memory of his own daughter, long since grown and gone, who had once looked at him with the same trusting gaze. One day, while they searched the hollowed-out remains of a once grand library, Hayes found a battered datapad filled with archived texts. A battered sign above the entrance read, "Library of the Ancients" in the local dialect. Stacks of half-burned books, their pages curled and blackened, littered the marble floor. Fragments of knowledge, once cherished by the citizens of Zephara, now lost to the ravages of conflict. Lyra peered at the texts, gently picking up a shard of a page. The alien script, though indecipherable, seemed to captivate her. The moment was haunting in its beauty. A child from one star system, standing in the wreckage of another, contemplating the ruined knowledge of ages past. Before leaving, Hayes made a point to salvage what he could. Stowing a handful of half-damaged books in the datapad on the Morningstar, he resolved to preserve some piece of Zephara's cultural legacy. Perhaps, one day, if the planet was ever restored, these fragments of its past would help future generations remember what had been lost and what might be reclaimed. Eventually, Hayes received an urgent recall from Coalition Command. His mission on Zephara had concluded, and the planet was deemed too far gone for immediate reconstruction. Troops were being withdrawn to defend more critical fronts in a galaxy-wide conflict that threatened to escalate into all-out war. Though the devastation he had witnessed weighed heavily on his heart, orders were orders. Yet one question remained: what would become of Lyra? Normally, standard protocol demanded that any alien refugees be processed through official channels. They would be placed under the care of humanitarian agencies, assuming such agencies existed for her species. But something in Hayes rebelled at the thought of handing her over to bureaucratic machinery. In the best of times, official channels were labyrinthine and impersonal. In the worst, they were downright exploitative. He had heard rumors of unscrupulous labs and black market rings eager to study or exploit rare xenobiological specimens. He refused to let that become Lyra's fate. When the time came to depart, he quietly stowed Lyra aboard the Morningstar, as though concealing contraband. With gentle reassurance, he coaxed her into his small storage nook lined with blankets, transforming it into a makeshift sleeping berth. Once they were airborne, leaving the ashen skies of Zephara behind, a wave of relief mingled with guilt swept over him. He was defying protocol. If discovered, he could face severe penalties. But in his mind, the cause was just. "Don't worry," he whispered to her as the starship's engines roared, propelling them into the upper atmosphere. "I'll look after you." Though she still wore the same uncertain expression, something in her eyes conveyed she had placed her trust in him completely. Breaking through Zephara's stratosphere, the Morningstar arced gracefully into space, revealing an endless tapestry of stars. Hayes engaged the ship's faster-than-light drive, setting a course for the nearest Coalition outpost, a space station orbiting the distant planet Orion, 4. As the ship vibrated with the hum of the engine's subspace field, Lyra clung to the seat, eyes wide with awe. She had never seen anything like it. For Hayes, it was a familiar routine. He had jumped through FTL corridors 1,000 times before. Yet this time, he felt the old thrill of exploration rekindle in his chest, sparked by the wonder shining on her face. The journey to Orion took several days, punctuated by the occasional drop from FTL to recharge the ship's graviton capacitors. During these intervals, Hayes and Lyra grew closer. He taught her more words in the common tongue, naming objects around the ship: seat, window, star, food. She learned quickly, eager to mimic the new sounds. She also shared fragments of her own language, though it was not easy for Hayes's human vocal apparatus. Still, his earnest attempts made her giggle, a soft, tinkling laugh that lightened the stale air of the cabin. He provided her with fresh clothes from his emergency stash, an oversized gray jumpsuit that dwarfed her frame. But with a belt cinched around her waist, it served well enough. When she slept, it was always fitful, riddled with nightmares that left her whimpering in the dark. Sometimes Hayes would wake to find her huddled in a corner, eyes unfocused, tears staining her cheeks. He would gently cradle her, whisper reassuring words, waiting until she drifted back into slumber. In those moments, he sensed the deep psychic scars war had inflicted on this vulnerable child. He, too, was no stranger to such scars. Though no civilian had ever labeled him a victim, he was the soldier. After all, he had lost friends in battles that spanned solar systems. He still dreamed about them sometimes: the swirling firefights, the bloodied corridors of starships, the deafening roar of orbital bombardments. The galaxy had grown smaller with every new conflict, yet simultaneously more fragmented and brutal. Clinging to one's humanity under such conditions was no small feat. When the Morningstar finally dropped out of FTL near Orion, 4, a breathtaking scene unfolded. The planet spun below, cloaked in swirling lavender clouds that sparkled with bioluminescent organisms drifting through the atmosphere. Orbiting above it was the Meridian Station, a massive ring-shaped structure bristling with docking bays, communication arrays, and defensive turrets. Coalition cruisers, supply freighters, and smaller vessels of all descriptions meandered around it like bees around a hive. Protocol required Hayes to file a standard docking request, which he did through official channels, carefully omitting any mention of an alien child. As he maneuvered the Morningstar into Dock 46, he glanced over at Lyra, who was gazing out the window with a mix of fear and wonder. "We'll have to be careful," he said. though more to himself than to her. But everything will be all right. Once they were docked, Hayes retrieved a worn cap from his footlocker and gently pulled it down over Lyra's head to help conceal her unusual features. The idea was far from foolproof. Her sky-blue skin and star-flecked cheeks would inevitably draw attention. Yet he hoped that, in the bustling chaos of Meridian Station, they might slip through without scrutiny. Stepping into the station's main thoroughfare was like plunging into a carnival of sights, sounds, and smells. Vendors hawked alien delicacies, from sizzling skewers of spiced saurian meat to luminous fruit cocktails served in crystalline flutes. Mechanical drones buzzed overhead, scanning cargo manifests, while uniformed soldiers marched in tight formation, their boots clanging on the metal deck plates. Lyra clung to Hayes, clearly overwhelmed by the clamor. He guided her to the station's medical bay first, intending to secure a thorough examination for her quietly and off the record, if possible. An old friend of Hayes, Dr. Sylvia Morgan, operated as head physician there. She was a tall, no-nonsense woman in her early 50s, with sharp hazel eyes and a compassion that rivaled Hayes's. He had served alongside her in a prior campaign, where she had risked her life countless times to tend to wounded soldiers on the battlefield. When he arrived in her cramped office, she was in the middle of reorganizing medical supplies. "Without looking up," she said, "who might you be, barging in like—" Her words froze when she saw Hayes and the small figure behind him. "Daniel," she exclaimed, setting down a box of syringes. "You look like you've aged another decade since we last met." "Probably have," Hayes replied with a weary smile. "I brought someone who needs your help." Morgan's gaze shifted to Lyra, and her expression softened. "My word, is she?" "She's an alien from Zephara. Found her starving among the ruins. I couldn't just leave her." Hayes exhaled deeply. "Please, Sylvia. If anyone asks, say she's some distant cousin's child I'm taking care of. I don't want her ending up in a lab." Morgan pursed her lips, her mind clearly racing with the ethical and legal implications. After a moment, she nodded. "All right, Daniel. I owe you too many favors to count. But we have to be careful. I'll do a preliminary health screening here in my office. Keep it off the official record as much as I can. Just promise me you'll find a safer arrangement for her soon." Hayes gave a resolute nod. "I promise." The medical examination revealed signs of malnutrition, mild dehydration, and multiple contusions, nothing that couldn't be healed with proper care and rest. Dr. Morgan administered vitamins and gave Hayes a regimen of dietary supplements to help Lyra recover. To Hayes's relief, Lyra did not seem to suffer from any chronic or life-threatening illnesses. Nevertheless, Morgan cautioned him that her physiology might harbor unknown complexities. For instance, her star-flecked skin suggested she might have some bioluminescent or thermoregulatory adaptations. Without more thorough tests, it was difficult to say. "You're doing the right thing, Daniel," Morgan said quietly as Lyra busied herself examining a stethoscope. "But be mindful. These days, the Coalition's policies regarding non-human refugees are complicated." Hayes nodded. "I won't let them take her. Not after everything she's been through." For a brief time, life on Meridian Station offered a respite from the horrors of Zephara. Lyra marveled at the crowds and the swirling patterns of ships outside the massive observation windows. Hayes booked a modest room at a hostel designed for low-ranking officers and traveling merchants. The quarters were cramped, a single bunk, a wash basin, and a small table, but it was more luxury than either of them had enjoyed on the battered planet they had left behind. Lyra's appetite returned with vigor. She devoured the station's standard rations of protein paste and nutrient crackers, though she quickly learned to prefer the sweet pastries sold by a jovial baker in the station's bazaar. Hayes, watching her delight in these small treats, felt a surge of paternal pride. The old soldier, who once had no one to come home to, found himself experiencing a sense of family that he had thought lost to the ravages of time and duty. Yet the galaxy was not content to remain at peace. Rumors spread of a rising threat, a fringe sect known as the Zarenth Dominion, rumored to possess advanced biotechnology and a fanatical ideology that regarded all other species as inferior. Coalition intelligence suggested they were behind the devastation on Zephara, testing new weaponry and sowing chaos to weaken the Coalition's foothold. Tensions were high, and many on the station feared that an attack could come at any moment. One evening, while Lyra slept in their cramped quarters, Hayes attended a confidential briefing for Coalition officers. The chamber was filled with stoic men and women of various species, each wearing the same grim expression. Admiral Kojima, a steely-eyed veteran with close-cropped hair, stepped to the forefront. Holographic images materialized in the air behind him. Maps of star systems, projections of fleet movements, and faint outlines of colossal, unidentified vessels. The Dominion's next target is believed to be the Arcadia system, Kojima announced. Recent reconnaissance indicates they're building a staging ground for further incursions. Our mission is to fortify Arcadia and intercept any Dominion fleet movements before they can strike Coalition planets. A silent tension rippled through the room. The Arcadia system was a vital trade hub, home to billions of civilians scattered across multiple planets. If the Dominion aimed to unleash their new weaponry there, the resulting casualties would be catastrophic. Hayes felt his stomach knot. He had seen firsthand the devastation wrought by advanced weapons on Zephara, and now he imagined that same horror visited upon an even more populous region of the galaxy. After the briefing, Kojima singled Hayes out. "Captain," she said in a measured tone, "I've seen your reports from Zephara. You have experience dealing with ground operations and civilian evacuations. I'm reassigning you to the Arcadia campaign. We need someone with moral clarity and tactical experience to minimize collateral damage. I trust you can do that." Hayes nodded. "Yes, Admiral. I'll do what I can." As he made his way back to his quarters, dread coiled around his heart. He had no desire to fight another campaign, especially now that Lyra depended on him. But refusing a direct order was unthinkable. The Coalition's chain of command would not permit it, and even if he did desert, he had nowhere else to take Lyra. They would be fugitives, constantly hunted. When Hayes returned, Lyra was awake, perched on the edge of the bunk, her violet eyes wide and reflective in the dim lighting. She seemed to sense his disquiet. Tentatively, she placed her small hand over his. "Day you'll worry?" A rueful smile touched his lips. Her grasp of the common tongue had improved, though the sentence was halting. "Yes," he admitted, placing his other hand gently over hers. "The galaxy seems to be on the brink again. I might be sent away to fight." She nodded, or tried to, though her expression revealed she did not fully grasp the complexities of war. She only understood that Hayes might have to leave, and that the idea troubled him deeply. "I come?" she ventured, her voice trembling. He hesitated. The thought of taking her into a war zone was unthinkable, yet leaving her behind was equally unpalatable. The Coalition would never officially sanction her presence. If discovered, she would be placed in a refugee camp or potentially turned into an unwilling test subject. Hayes's mind whirled. Could he find some safe haven for her while he was on assignment? But who could he trust? Dr. Morgan, perhaps, but she was already under scrutiny as a medical officer. She might not be able to keep Lyra hidden indefinitely. "Listen to me," Hayes said softly, placing a hand on Lyra's cheek. "No matter what, I won't abandon you. We'll figure this out together." "All right." Lyra's eyes brimmed with tears, but she nodded. For a moment, they sat in silence, each taking comfort in the other's presence. In that cramped, utilitarian bunk, they formed a makeshift family. It was fragile, a single candle flame flickering in the tempest of interstellar conflict. But sometimes, a single flame can banish the darkness in a way that legions cannot. True to the Admiral's warning, the Dominion launched a rapid, brutal offensive against the Arcadia system. Within days, Hayes and countless other Coalition forces mobilized from Meridian Station, heading toward the threatened worlds. Though standard protocol forbade dependents or unauthorized aliens from boarding military vessels, Hayes managed to stow Lyra aboard the Morning Star, just as he had done when leaving Zephara. He rationalized it by telling himself that, in a war zone, there was no truly safe place to leave her anyway. The journey to Arcadia was tense. Coalition fleets hastily erected blockade lines, while Dominion ships prowled the outskirts of the system, testing defenses with smaller skirmishes. In the midst of this precarious standoff, Lyra remained in hiding within the Morning Star's cargo hold, which Hayes had converted into a livable space. She occupied her time by reading the battered books Hayes had salvaged from Zephara's library, though much of the text was incomprehensible to her. Still, she studied the pictures and diagrams with rapt fascination, as if trying to piece together the fragments of a lost world. The moment the Coalition fleet exited FTL near Arcadia's outer rim, klaxons blared. Dominion warships surged forward, their hulls bristling with turret-like structures that glowed malevolently. Lances of energy cut through the vacuum, lighting it with deadly spectacle. The Coalition's capital ships responded in kind, launching fighter squadrons and returning artillery fire. A grand, terrible dance of destruction unfolded against the star-flecked canvas of space. Hayes's orders were to lead a ground detachment on Arcadia Prime, the system's central planet and a hub of commerce. Intelligence indicated Dominion shock troopers would drop to the surface in an attempt to seize critical infrastructure. The Coalition aimed to secure Arcadia Prime's orbital elevator, an immense structure that tethered an orbital station to the surface, vital for transporting cargo and troops. If it fell into Dominion hands, the entire planet could be brought to its knees. Upon landing, Hayes found Arcadia Prime a stark contrast to Zephara's ruins. Towering skyscrapers dominated the skyline, their neon lights and polished architecture testament to the planet's prosperity. Yet the panic in the streets was unmistakable. Civilians packed starports, desperate to evacuate. The roar of overhead fighters streaked across the sky, occasionally drowned out by the rumbling of distant explosions. With grim efficiency, Hayes deployed his men at strategic checkpoints around the orbital elevator complex. He coordinated with local defense forces, fortifying key routes and establishing anti-air defenses. In the midst of this carefully orchestrated operation, he could not help but worry about Lyra. She remained aboard the Morning Star, docked at a secure hangar on the outskirts of the city. He had left strict instructions for her to stay hidden, but he knew she was a curious soul. The mere thought of her wandering through a war-torn city brought cold sweat to his brow. Before long, the Dominion struck. A swarm of drop pods descended through the planet's stratosphere, blazing trails of fire across the twilight sky. Alarms shrieked, and Coalition troops scrambled to intercept. The drop pods slammed into the cityscape with seismic force, opening like hellish flowers to reveal heavily armored Dominion troopers armed with advanced plasma rifles. Hayes directed his platoon with the precision of a seasoned officer, setting up choke points and creating crossfires that caught the invaders off guard. The streets became a battleground of neon reflections and sizzling plasma bolts. Civilians huddled in shelters, the city's once vibrant nightlife replaced by the haunting red glow of emergency lights. During the chaos, Hayes received an urgent message. Dominion saboteurs had infiltrated the orbital elevator's base station. A meltdown threat loomed if they tampered with the station's core. Cursing under his breath, Hayes led a strike team to neutralize the threat. Navigating a labyrinth of maintenance corridors, they confronted the saboteurs in a pitched firefight. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off metal walls, and the shriek of energy weapons echoed in the confined space. One by one, the Dominion infiltrators fell. By the time the last saboteur was incapacitated, Hayes's shoulder throbbed from a glancing shot, and half his men nursed injuries. But the elevator's core remained secure. Emerging onto a wide observation deck that ringed the tower, Hayes gazed out at the city below. Fires dotted the skyline, and swirling smoke mixed with Arcadia's luminescent haze. The cost of preventing an all-out Dominion occupation was staggering. He closed his eyes momentarily, picturing Lyra huddled in the Morning Star, hoping she was safe. When dawn finally broke over the city, a tenuous calm settled. Coalition forces had staved off the first wave of Dominion attackers, but intelligence reports suggested another assault was imminent. Exhausted yet resolute, Hayes returned to the hangar to check on Lyra. He found her curled up in the pilot's seat, the flickering lights of the instrument panel casting dancing shadows on her face. She stirred awake when he stepped inside, relief washing over her expression. "Dayul," she whispered. "Safe." He removed his helmet and sat beside her, letting out a long sigh. "For now, but it's not over." A tinge of sadness flickered in her eyes. She reached up and touched the dried blood on his sleeve, her lips curving downward in dismay. "Hurt?" He shook his head, forcing a small smile. "A scratch. I'm all right." For a moment, father and daughter, though not by blood, simply sat together, each finding some semblance of solace in the other's presence. In this stolen instant, the roar of war faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of two hearts that had somehow found each other in an uncaring galaxy. Yet the respite could not last. The hangar reverberated with a deep rumble as a Dominion cruiser broke through the planetary defense grid, unleashing a swarm of fighter craft. Sirens blared throughout the complex. Coalition soldiers mobilized in panic, trying to mount a last-ditch defense. Hayes tensed, weighing his duty against the promise he had made to Lyra. He knew he had to return to his post to rally his men. But leaving her here, unguarded, was unthinkable. Steeling himself, he grasped Lyra's shoulders gently. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "Keep the hatch sealed. No matter what, do not open it unless I come back." Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. "Come back," she whispered. The Dominion assault was swift and merciless. Their cruiser hovered in low orbit, launching precision strikes that obliterated coalition defenses and inflicted heavy civilian casualties. The city's power grid faltered, plunging entire districts into darkness. Through the chaos, Hayes fought valiantly alongside his men. They held crucial intersections, providing safe corridors for civilians to flee. Still, the coalition's lines were fracturing under the onslaught. Reports crackled over the comm. Dominion reinforcements had landed near the orbital elevator, aiming to seize it once and for all. If they gained control of the elevator, the planet would be effectively lost. Halfway to the tower, Hayes's unit came under heavy fire. Plasma beams raked the street, carving molten scars into the pavement. One of the men was hit, his armor disintegrating in a burst of sparks. Hayes dragged him behind cover, administering emergency aid. The soldier's breathing rattled, and Hayes recognized the telltale signs of mortal injury. Cradling the man's head, Hayes whispered words of comfort until the man's eyes glazed over. The soldier died with a final ragged exhale. Fury roared within Hayes. He pushed forward, the muzzle of his rifle flashing as he led the counterattack. They pressed the Dominion troopers back, foot by bloody foot, until they reached the elevator base station. Yet what they found was devastating. The Dominion had already disabled the primary cooling systems of the reactor that powered the elevator. A meltdown was in progress. Scrambling to the control center, Hayes's team discovered a nest of Dominion engineers feverishly working at the terminals. A frantic gunfight erupted. The coalition troops managed to dispatch the saboteurs, but not before the meltdown timer reached a critical point. If the meltdown occurred, the resultant explosion would engulf miles of the city. Alarms wailed, and lights flashed ominously throughout the facility. Hayes surveyed the control panels, desperately looking for a way to shut down the meltdown sequence. But the Dominion had encrypted the system with malicious code. A full manual override would take hours, time they didn't have. "Sir," gasped one of the technicians, who had managed to slice into part of the system. "There's an emergency release for the station's core, but it's designed for sabotage containment. It'll jettison the reactor into the upper atmosphere, where it'll detonate harmlessly. The problem is, someone has to manually uncouple it." A single look at the schematics told Hayes that the manual release was located in a separate chamber, accessible only by climbing through the station's service shafts. In other words, it was a one-way mission. The volunteer would almost certainly face lethal doses of radiation once the meltdown process concluded. Hayes's men looked at him, and he saw in their eyes the same recognition of what this task entailed. One of his younger sergeants stepped forward, trembling but resolute. "I'll do it, sir." Hayes felt his throat tighten. The soldier was barely out of his teens, clearly terrified. "No," Hayes said quietly, setting a hand on the sergeant's shoulder. "I'll do it. I'm not going to send a kid to his death." "Sir, you have a child to look after," the sergeant began, but Hayes cut him off with a firm look. "That's exactly why I need to do it," Hayes answered, voice catching. "Stay here. Keep the station secure. Make sure the civilians are safe. That's an order." With that, Hayes grabbed a radiation shield from a nearby rack, thin protection at best, and sprinted for the service shafts. He climbed a ladder slick with condensation, his mind whirling with thoughts of Lyra. Would she stay in the Morning Star as he instructed? Would she survive if this meltdown destroyed half the city? Would she ever know how much he cared, how he had tried to protect her from the worst the galaxy had to offer? A final hatch led him into the reactor control chamber. The temperature was scorching, and the hum of unstable energy reverberated through the metal walls. Flames danced along conduits, and sparks rained from torn cables. With trembling hands, he located the emergency release mechanism. a large lever encased in a protective shell. The meltdown timer read, less than a minute remaining. He yanked the lever. A thunderous clang reverberated through the chamber. The reactor housing began to separate from the station, guided by magnetic clamps that would propel it skyward. For a moment, Hayes felt a jolt of hope. If the system worked as intended, the meltdown would be carried out of the atmosphere before it could devastate the city. But then a crackle of static on the overhead speaker indicated a system failure. Perhaps the Dominion's sabotage was too extensive. One of the clamps refused to release. The meltdown countdown continued. 15 seconds. Without hesitation, Hayes lunged for the malfunctioning clamp controls, ignoring the searing heat that scalded his hand through the thin glove. He manually disengaged the circuit, feeling a surge of power race up his arm. Pain exploded in his nerves, and for an instant, his vision blurred. 10 seconds. The clamp finally released with a grinding shriek. The reactor module lurched free, rising away from the station. 5 seconds. Hayes collapsed to the floor. Electricity still arced through the air, scorching the metal grates. His entire body ached, and he coughed up blood, the acrid scent of ozone filling his lungs. 0. A distant explosion thundered through the sky as the reactor detonated above Arcadia's stratosphere, sparing the city below. Hayes exhaled, relief mingling with a strange sense of finality. He had done it. The city, and likely thousands of lives, were saved. But he knew the radiation surging through this chamber would be lethal. His vision dimmed, and he thought, almost dreamily, of Lyra. In his fading consciousness, he pictured her face, bright and hopeful. Perhaps, he thought, he had secured a future for her, even if he would not be there to witness it. Some time later, Hayes could not be sure how long, he awoke to faint voices. His eyelids felt as heavy as lead, and every breath sent a flare of pain through his chest. A white haze filled his vision until it gradually sharpened, revealing the interior of a medical vessel. Tubes and wires snaked around him, connected to machines that beeped softly in a synchronized rhythm. A figure appeared above him, and for a moment, he thought it was Dr. Morgan. But this doctor was different, an Arcadian physician by the look of his uniform, a stern-faced man with an air of efficiency. "Captain Hayes," he said quietly, "can you hear me?" Hayes attempted a nod, but the movement was barely perceptible. The physician explained that emergency responders had found him near death. He had been stabilized with advanced medical procedures. Radiation poisoning still threatened his organs, but they were trying experimental treatments. His survival was precarious, contingent on a long recovery. "Where is she?" Hayes rasped, his throat parched. A flicker of confusion crossed the doctor's face. "Who?" Realization dawned on Hayes. They might not know about Lyra. With a Herculean effort, he summoned enough strength to croak. "Girl, my daughter. Alien. Help her." The doctor glanced aside, exchanging a concerned look with a nurse. "We'll make inquiries," he said at length. "But rest now. You're in no condition to worry." Days blurred into weeks. Hayes drifted in and out of consciousness, each moment a battle against the toxins ravaging his body. He dreamt of Zephara, of the ruins where he had found Lyra, of the morning star carrying them through star-flecked nights. He relived the meltdown chamber, the clamp that refused to release, the surge of pain. Often, he woke calling her name, only to find himself alone in the sterile glow of medical instruments. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Morgan herself appeared at his bedside. She wore the coalition uniform, her face lined with worry. "You stubborn old fool," she said softly, though there was relief in her tone. "Lyra," Hayes managed to whisper. Morgan sat down, gently taking his hand. "She's safe. The meltdown was averted, and your men found her aboard the Morning Star shortly after the battle ended. She refused to leave the ship, demanded to see you. But they wouldn't allow her in a high-security med bay until the situation stabilized." A wave of gratitude washed over Hayes, tears stinging his eyes. "Thank you," he managed. Morgan shook her head, eyes glimmering with admiration. "Thank yourself. You saved half a city, and you saved her." She paused, then carefully added, "She's been learning to speak better. She insisted on leaving you messages. She said she's waiting for father to come home." Hayes' heart clenched. He closed his eyes, picturing Lyra's face. "I want to see her," he said, voice cracking. Morgan nodded. Once your condition stabilizes a bit more, I'll bring her in. Just rest. You've done enough." Over the subsequent weeks, Hayes's body waged a slow battle for survival. The doctors administered advanced gene therapy and nanomachine injections to counteract the radiation damage. Each day, he grew fractionally stronger. Finally, a time came when he could sit up in bed without the world spinning. And so, they brought Lyra to him. The door slid open, and she stood timidly at the threshold, wearing a loose-fitting hospital gown designed for pediatric patients. Her violet eyes widened when she saw him upright, alive. She rushed to his side, throwing her slender arms around him. For a moment, neither spoke, tears doing what words could not. "Father," she whispered at last, her common tongue improved but still delicately accented. You came back." A lump formed in Hayes's throat. He stroked her hair, recalling how close he had come to never seeing her again. "I'm here," he said thickly, voice trembling. With Morgan's discreet assistance, they arranged for Lyra to stay in safe quarters near the hospital. Word of Hayes's heroism spread through the coalition ranks, and even some high-ranking officers turned a blind eye to the irregularities of Lyra's presence. After all, the man who had saved Arcadia Prime deserved some latitude in the matter. In the weeks that followed, as the planet began to rebuild from the Dominion siege, Hayes convalesced under Morgan's watchful eye. Lyra spent every spare moment by his side, often curled up at the foot of the bed, reading from the salvaged Zephara books, or simply holding his hand. A father and daughter, forged in the crucible of war, found in each other the love that transcended species and circumstance. As Hayes regained strength, he was summoned to meet with Admiral Kojima. Expecting a reprimand for breaching protocol by harboring Lyra, he arrived at the Admiral's private office with a mixture of trepidation and resignation. Kojima, however, met him with an unexpected warmth. "Captain Hayes," she began, "you disobeyed certain regulations, yes. But you also saved thousands of lives. The Coalition is grateful. Furthermore, we've come to understand that the child you rescued has no remaining relatives, or at least none we can locate. Under these extraordinary circumstances, the Coalition is prepared to grant you guardianship rights, provided you meet certain conditions." Hayes's heart soared. "Thank you, Admiral," he managed, barely containing his relief. "I will do whatever is necessary to keep her safe." Kojima nodded, her expression softening. "We have a new mission for you, Captain, though it's not the kind of assignment you might expect. The war is far from over, and your injuries preclude frontline duty for the foreseeable future. But we believe your skills and your compassion could be of immense value in refugee operations. We want you to help coordinate relief efforts in war-torn sectors, ensuring that what happened on Zephara does not happen again." Hayes straightened, saluting. Though his body still ached, a sense of purpose filled him. "I accept." Some months later, the Morning Star soared through the endless black of space, its engines humming with renewed vigor. Hayes sat at the helm, his once grizzled face now carrying a quiet contentment beneath the lines etched by age and hardship. At his side, wearing a specially tailored jumpsuit, sat Lyra, her violet eyes shining with excitement. They were en route to New Horizon, a space station dedicated to housing and rehabilitating refugees from Dominion-affected worlds. Hayes had been placed in charge of the Coalition's humanitarian outreach, tasked with ensuring that children like Lyra found not just sanctuary, but the nurturing environment they needed to heal and thrive. As they cruised through hyperspace, Lyra's gaze drifted to the swirling patterns of cosmic light beyond the cockpit window. "Daniel," she ventured, her voice still gently accented, "thank you for saving me." He smiled, reaching out to gently ruffle her hair. "You saved me, too, Lyra. More than you'll ever know." In the months since Arcadia Prime, she had grown taller, her once-starved frame filling out with good nutrition and regular care. Her language skills had blossomed, and she was voracious in her appetite for knowledge. She often asked Hayes about Earth, about the other human worlds, and about the Coalition's dream of galactic peace. He never hid the harsh truths of conflict from her, but he also spoke of hope. Hope that one day, the galaxy might outgrow its endless wars. Now, as they traveled to bring aid to those who had lost everything, they did so as a family. Hayes knew their journey would be fraught with challenges. The Dominion was not vanquished, and countless other threats lurked in the far corners of the galaxy. But together, they would face whatever the future held. A father and daughter, bound not by blood, but by the shared experience of survival and the simple, profound power of kindness. A soft chime alerted them to the end of the hyperspace corridor. With a smooth deceleration, the morning star emerged into real space. Ahead, New Horizon Station glimmered like a beacon of hope, ringed by cargo vessels and rescue ships. Over the comm, a friendly voice granted them docking clearance, welcoming them by name. Hayes guided the ship toward the station, his heart calm with a conviction he had not felt in years. Beside him, Lyra gazed at the station with a mixture of anticipation and resolve. She would help, too. She had insisted on it. The trauma of her early life had forged in her an empathy beyond her years. Together, they would offer solace to those in need, bridging differences of species and culture the way they had bridged their own. The docking clamps engaged, and Hayes powered down the engines. Before unbuckling her harness, Lyra turned to him, her violet eyes shining with sincerity. "We do good work, yes?" she asked in her gentle, earnest way. "Yes," Hayes replied, his voice catching slightly. "We do good work." They stood, father and daughter, side by side, ready to step into the station's bright corridors and begin a new chapter in their shared story. The future remained uncertain, as it always does in a galaxy rife with turmoil. But in that moment, they carried in their hearts a radiant optimism that not even the darkest war could extinguish. They had each other, and that was enough. Enough to face new challenges, enough to dare to dream of peace, and enough to rewrite, in their own small way, the fate of countless lives across the stars. In the end, the galaxy did not magically transform overnight, nor did all conflicts instantly cease. But for those who found shelter at New Horizon, for every hungry child fed and every wounded soul comforted, the difference was incalculable. And every life touched by Captain Daniel Hayes and Lyra, his beloved alien daughter, stood as a testament that even amid the vast, uncaring cosmos, the pure light of compassion could guide weary travelers home.